How do you conceptualize the relationship between your work and its exhibition context? In particular, what desires or expectations did you have in mind when creating work to be presented at the scale of Piccadilly Circus?
Scale's always been a really, really interesting question for me. It's interesting, it's almost like the abstract audience, which I never can quite wrap my head around. I think it's always kind of speculation in a way, but sometimes it can lead you to interesting and maybe more complicated places. In this particular venue, which I've done some public and semi-public small interventions before, but I haven't done anything that was kind of intended to be read at this scale. Um, I mean, there are always like complications and near misses and other examples. But for this, I knew, approximately what the scale would be. And I, thought a little bit, you know, how to make it work in a larger context. And I started looking at the dimensions of the actual file size for the project, and I said, "Oh yeah, this is like several times larger than the standard frame."
Mhm.
Um, and it actually caused me to relax a little bit in the sense that I thought what I wanted to do was, since it was going to be relatively large, it sort of caused me to think maybe it would be better to approach it, a little bit less public and maybe to move towards something that would, I began thinking about like subcultures that appear in broad publics and the ways in which they code themselves or use vernacular language or kind of adjust themselves to that kind of public, and that instead of imagining that you can just do the same thing, which would be one way of approaching it at much larger scale. I thought, well, maybe it should change, the ways in which things are um, inscribed and put out there. And so I decided to make a kind of take a kind of part of my practice. I usually use these coded kinds of gestures for titles of pieces or titles of projects, and not as like content, but I thought it might be interesting because this was going out, quote unquote, in a large, more public sphere, to kind of turn away a little bit from, standard, reading and writing procedures. And so I kind of took it as a challenge, that here's something that's going to be, or potentially broadly legible in one way, and I thought it would be interesting to kind of withdraw the utterance in another way. And I was not interested in being indecipherable, but I was interested in it being, yeah, a kind of just a little bit awry, just a little bit. I guess the idea was not too public, not too easily legible. And I think in part I thought that it was a way of addressing a public, but also maintaining a certain distance and, sort of playing with, the kind of a scale of legibility. I don't know. I also had this thought that I've always had this kind of understanding about scale as a kind of possibility and audience as a possibility. And I guess it's not so much the raw numbers, it's not quantifiable in my view. It's almost as though there's a certain quality of attention and desire that needs to be there on the part of the viewer. And if it's not there, then maybe it's okay that things are somewhat jumbled and somewhat lost. It's a kind of calculated risk, I guess, I've learned to take over the years, not to be too dependent on this expectation of clarity and legibility. Maybe because I was thinking too about, the ads that come before and come after, which always want to, I think, um, position and implicate the viewer in a particular way and in a particular sort of register with a certain type of intensity. And I thought it might be interesting to pull back a little in the way that, often, as I say, subcultures, minorities protect themselves in public through recourse to a coded language.
Yeah, I'd like to return to this question of encoding or legibility in maybe a few minutes, but I think I'd like to add on a question perhaps about how you've addressed or treated this relationship um, between the exhibition, the material itself, and the audience in past projects. For example, in projects where you've used LED walls within a gallery space versus projects where you've employed the form of the book, and how this calculated risk has played out in other venues using other materials. And even, if I remember correctly, um, a work that you had that revolved around posters, right? And this comes close to this idea of the advertisement here,
Mhm.
uh, but I'm sure revolves around a different type of interpolation, a different form of hailing the viewer. So yeah,
Yeah,
how has this functioned in the past?
yeah, it's functioned in a number of different ways. I think when I go into exhibition projects in particular, but I think it's also true of like commissions for something like postering, I try to think about the relationship and maybe habits of presentation and interpolation then. Um, with regard to the work, I often try, for instance, if it's a large scale exhibition project, I always try to have more than one kind of viewing apparatus and viewing scale, maybe because I'm not too preoccupied, but I'm kind of thinking about modes of delivery as much as I'm thinking about what the alleged content of the individual pieces are. And I kind of like to um, play with, scales and expectations. Sometimes, let's say in the public postering project, I wanted to do something that was direct, but that kind of implicated the normal use of that context and venue. So I made something that was kind of explicitly addressing advertising in that instance. Whereas with maybe a video exhibition, I'm often trying to pull in a variety of scales and maybe histories of presentation to rehearse maybe in some small part how this information has either been historically or institutionally delivered. Um, I think I did, let's see, in 2012 in Los Angeles, I did an exhibition where I was very conscious that there was a certain amount of material that I wanted to deliver. It was like 45 works from about 15 years of my production, many of which had not even been seen in the US during that period. And I said, but I want to stage this, and how do I go about it? And so there was a set of three 80s Sony monitors outside the main exhibition space. You go inside, there's a fairly large black and white projection. There are three flat screen monitors kind of in the smallish range. And, I kind of tweaked them in certain ways. So it was the same content, but there were all these different kind of addresses in terms of scale and in terms of projection versus monitors. There was a larger color monitor in the background, um, and then there was a huge projection with sound system. And yeah, I was just trying to take the expected sort of norms of the apparatus and kind of spatialize and temporalize them. Um, Mainly because it was like, no, I don't want to just show large scale projections and that be kind of all, all the repertoire that I wanted or needed. Um, for that project, it was like I wanted to use every subset of the space. So I used the entrance and exit to the parking garage to stage some works that were silent, for instance. And I had one series of works that was presented in the cafe, in the bar, um, because I was thinking, it's not just standard, whatever it is, white cube or black box display systems where we see media. We see media kind of almost everywhere. And also for that project, which had a large number of works, I decided I wanted to make 8 weekly programs that were, different from one another, and some of which were repeated in other sites. Like I made 3 selections of the major series that the work um, occupied on these, small monitors. So they would be present in some form, but only, kind of a selection of them. We also arranged to make the whole exhibition, all 45 works, available via, it was a kind of internet-based archive. So you could look at things on your phone as well. And, not to say that everything is the same, but actually, thinking about them and their presences as kind of iterative, that they were, on the one hand, available, but on the other hand, if you came to see the exhibition, you would probably see something relatively different, but I like the idea. In fact, we were actually looking for a physical location for something that might be an archival display. And unfortunately, we kept looking for spaces within this cultural institution, and every non-gallery space that we wanted to use was occupied in one way or another. I mean, we did get some non-gallery spaces, don't get me wrong, but we kept looking for some place to put the archive, and it just never materialized. And so, we said, okay, well, we'll make it virtual then. And it was an interesting way, again, of maybe thinking about the form of exhibitions. And that's something I, sometimes I've had a very, you could say, problematic, well, not really, but differential relationship with exhibition conditions. I think my first major project was an installation, which basically only happened once. And so it kind of taught me that, as wonderful as it might be to do a kind of purpose-built set for an exhibition condition, that you might want to be more strategic in finding multiple ways to meet audiences. But sometimes I've made very, very specific gestures, like when I did the project at the Shed. It was like I had used LED screens, and the space was large, and I couldn't imagine just having things on the walls, even as projections. And I thought, what I'd like to do is occupy the space in a kind of almost both architectural in terms of the scale, and also um, to produce a certain kind of optical illusion, in a way, in the way the works were placed in relationship to one another. And it was, an adventure in the sense that I hadn't done it before, but the sort of scale of the space kind of made me think there must be another way of presenting these pieces and relating, them to that space. I tend to, I probably am not old school enough to say make site-specific work, but I try to be um, sensitive in some ways to the context and the scale of the space. And I'd like to, be in the space sometimes. Of course, today that's not quite possible, with the COVID condition. But I try to at least think in some way, to account for um, where the thing is located, what its relationships might be, maybe if only to conventions of presentation. Even if, sometimes it's a little bit more specific than that. And it depends on the, kind and quality of time I have in the space, or access to documentation of, the space and how it's been used in the past. For instance, I'm a little bit fascinated with that, with spaces. I like to ask, questions about what's been a good use of the space, what's been a difficult or problematic use of the space. It doesn't always mean I'll take the easiest route, but it just means that I kind of want there to be a kind of relationality. And I think it may have something to do with kind of more general conditions of mediation. You know, I think in one of the earlier talks, I might have mentioned, that there was this idea that the artist appear with the work and contextualize it and, talk about its intentions, its processes, etc. And then pretty early on in my career, I realized that that's not always possible. And then I began to think, maybe that's not even always necessary. In fact, there's a way in which misreadings can be productive, or you kind of fend for yourself in trying to contextualize what something is and how it operates. And that, maybe in terms of my own, education, I found that sometimes having the horse there to speak the truth about, the object kind of caused me to ask more questions than get, kind of resolved answers out of that exchange. And I thought, yeah, now my work is being shown in festivals, places where I cannot and not necessarily would want to appear. And, is the work getting proper readings? And it's almost like um, I hand it over, in a strange way to the viewer. Um, I can't, I would like to control as many, aspects as I can be aware of, but it's almost like a kind of fantasy of, of control over media. I mean, and over meaning to some extent. And I'm not quite sure that's possible. I'm kind of at pains to, to try to position things in ways um, that are complex and that maybe provoke questions and thoughts on the part of the viewer. But yeah, at a certain point, I realized that I can't control it. I can maybe steer it, but not absolute control. And so I think when I have opportunities to do installations, I take it as a kind of opportunity to, think in spatial terms, whereas, often it's not, the work cannot and perhaps need not be seen in those kinds of conditions. But I like the idea that there's that flexibility and that one can, pressurize and cause new relations, like in juxtapositions of works. Um, that is kind of possible and, in a certain level desirable when it can happen. But, often it's not. I, have no control over it. So I do what I can, piecemeal, work by work. But it also, I think exhibition making allows me to think through the relationships between works in a way that might be, visible or legible if you, know the work and its trajectory. But I think it's a kind of on-site object lesson, that I may not, how should I put it? I may not want to control so much, that I'm open to thinking about new ways of looking at these things, usually with which I'm relatively familiar. I think it's in some ways, it's opening up the work for me and allows me a chance to rethink the work. Even, work from different periods, or work from, relatively far away in time, and also, of course, more recent things. Um, yeah. It allows me to maybe look and listen to the works in different ways.
Yeah, and for the viewer to do the same.
I hope, yes.
Right. And to produce these fields in which misreading can occur, but as you said, never to produce the singular reading,
Yeah,
the reading.
it's for me, it's almost as though I don't believe that it could be the same twice in any case.
Mhm,
And so one could be open to thinking about, relations as opposed to concentrating on a kind of singular object.
mhm,
And, I think often my work has, fragments um, embedded in it. And so it I think kind of again, opens up and reconfigures the work through juxtaposition, which yeah, it's like, hey, if you wanted to watch things one by one, if you depending on what you chose, it would probably have, a kind of differential effect anyway. So if you're going to have two things inhabiting the same or contiguous spaces, that they might actually complicate one another, or as opposed to have this linear, implication or spatialization.
yeah, well, I'm thinking about a few a few things that you mentioned. One of which is this this reference to the optical illusion and the way in which the piece as a sculptural form in a space with the particular relationships of color and montage that you employ can produce these forms of illusion, these forms of movement that are felt sort of in a perceptual way,
Mhm.
that are felt in a tactile sense. But I'm also thinking about this question of reading and misreading, and at some level, your films are always about or are always interested in this act of reading, reading as a physical or temporal process, reading as an ongoing labor of interpretation, or reading as a site of contestation and exchange, as both between the viewer and the work, these sort of intertextualities occur, and also between the works themselves in an exhibition space, as you've just been mentioning.
Yeah,
There's always, even in these tightly controlled environments, a sort of bleed effect from one piece to another, where these things that maybe haven't been seen next to one another begin to produce these mores between them, right?
yeah.
Um, can you discuss the connection between this focus on reading and your work's function as a site of social interpretation and reinterpretation?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, or set of questions. I mean, it's there's a a number of things I guess that I think about reading. I think reading in public or reading in a context that is not singular and atomized has always been interesting to me. And there's there I guess these historical debates about the place of the novel, say, in terms of inculcating a certain type of subjectivity and consumption and those kinds of modalities. But I kind of like that. How should I put it? That the text kind of escapes the book and then begins to escape, the video container in which it's originally placed. And I like the idea maybe of a more public modality of reading, and maybe that's also the fragmentation within pieces and juxtapositions within pieces are gestures towards a non sort of singular address to text. Some people have talked about a kind of Benjaminian notion of distracted reading,
Mhm.
that it's not meant to be read linearly as one would read a book. It has been edited and you could argue composited and represented in such a way that there's almost like a kind of implication that there are multiple readers and multiple readings, even inside the piece, and that you can maybe follow an argument or a set of juxtapositions, and that's, great, and I'm actually going for that to some extent. But there's also an awareness that what you're looking at is also been filtered in some way, that it's not self-evident, that because it's been recontextualized and because its presentation has a pace and has been related to music, it is not necessarily what one would experience if one were reading. And often, I kind of conceive of some of the pieces as, rereadings of poorly read texts. It's like things that already have an existence, already have been published, already have had audiences. And then the question becomes, what what is at stake in repositioning, those materials? Um, for me, I think it is, I hope to point to a way of opening up the text and reading again, or reading in maybe a less closed and less consumption oriented um, framework. That they're not necessarily, you can't necessarily attend to them. They're excerpts from, things, sometimes, different areas of the same text, sometimes juxtapositions of multiple texts. Um, and sometimes it's difficult to tell, where something begins or where another thing picks up. I think too, maybe that's one of the things that I've been historically preoccupied with, to try to kind of give a social and a polyvocality to text, as opposed to it being sort of like a stream of words coming from a singular, positioned author. I'm sometimes really interested in decontextualizing and recontextualizing certain rhetorics in speech so that we might actually look at it, you could argue, for what it is, a kind of filter or a kind of rhetoric, you know. And it's interesting sometimes to just, if only for a few minutes, to separate, utterances from their authors, to read them, not, not to sort of identify them and think that we know and understand something, but to actually look at the language in a way. Um, and maybe it's uh, I guess some might argue that that's abstracting things, but I usually pull it back in terms of reference by the end. But I first want to take things apart and let them breathe, or let readers think about the weight and implications of the words in a different way than if you mark it out at the very beginning, this is a quotation from, or sometimes I do. I do an author's attribution, but only sometimes when I do it at the beginning, I almost do it to mark the opposite of what one would normally expect. Like, for instance, a text like Disco Inferno, which I used for Evil 16 torture music. The reason I chose it was because it had many kind of texts and approaches inside of it. I had done pretty extensive, research on the question of music in enhanced interrogations. And I had looked at a fair number of texts, and it was a text that had been approached in the popular press um, for, quite a while in the sort of middle of the 2000s. And there was beginning to become a critical mass even of scholarly literature on this question and problem. And having, read a good bit of, framing material, instead of doing what maybe in other circumstances I might have done, which was take, one paragraph from a scholarly text and one paragraph from a newspaper article, ostensibly on the same subject, and think about their relationships to one another. I happened upon a text that kind of did both those operations simultaneously. They were, on the one hand, talking about the effects and reception of, news about this practice on one hand, and then doing a kind of, critical analysis of that practice and what it might mean on the other. And so it was kind of like I did some excerpting for sure, but it was like both registers and their complexities were there already. And so I said, I'll name the author here because, it's a hybrid text already. And, it might be a way of marking that in an unexpected way. It's like, nope, I didn't cobble these together. This was cobbled together already and presented in this way. And, but often as not, the attribution is after.
Well, just thinking about this last thing that you mentioned, which was, I didn't cobble this together. This was cobbled together already, right? This accusation of abstraction, or this idea that you're abstracting from the text, implies that there's something coherent or particular or concrete about the text itself.
Yeah.
What's fascinating about this attention to reading as a physical process is that you recognize it for its abstraction, for its sort of conceptuality,
Right.
and also in this manner of distraction, where if you aren't paying attention for a moment, the screen will pass you by, and therefore you won't be able to pick up on
Yeah.
the thread, at least for a moment.
For a
You'll be
moment. Yeah.
right. And so I guess this comes to another question, similar to the idea of reading, but about legibility. In three of the works that are going up in Piccadilly Circus, you've decided to encode the textual material. But this is only one form in which you play with the notion of the legible and the illegible. Would you say a few words about how you understand the contradictions, aporias, or conditions of legibility in the materials that you cite, and about how your pieces take up this problem of the legible?
Yeah. Maybe one thing I'd like to dispel a little bit at the outset is
Mhm.
sometimes I've heard people, not so much lately, but I've heard people say, do I have to know all the references in order to? And it's sort of like, well, that's impossible. I could barely know that myself, and I constructed it. Um, that, yeah, there's a certain impossibility, certain slippages are bound to happen. Um, there can't be a kind of full and totalized presence, at least in my view. I guess I'm a kind of old school Derridian in that, it's sort of like things slip by. You imagine things that make, connections. You can always look again. I kind of like that possibility of iterability, that you can go back, but of course it'll be different. You may have experienced something, in between the readings. Um, and I feel that reading is multiply constituted. It's not a singular thing. I wish it were a singular event, for, all those desires for permanence or meaning in a kind of, capitalized way. But I think it's more furtive than that. Um, and I think it's almost like are, it implies that you are a participant in the meaning, and that there may be limits or conditions, on reading, and that there may be certain pressures on reading, including the desire to, understand everything, and to know everything. And it's like, I find that both, fascinating, that people imagine that there is, a totalized or totalizable um, reading. And it's like, well, I may not have access to that. And it's, kind of a commonplace that, I just write it, but, or I just edit it, but, my desires are there too, to be read, or things that I may not know are also there to be read, almost as symptoms. Um, and that seems to me to be a kind of more sensible model of reading and its processes than this idea that I understand it all and I'm meant to get, quote unquote, everything, And it's like, well, you may get some things. And, maybe the next time or in a different place, you may get something else. And that's kind of for me at least, how reading is. It's not a product, in that kind of, we can measure it, we can quantify it, and we know what a good reading is. It's like, again, I may go back to my own, habits of reading and misreading text. It's almost like my interest is not in a kind of like certainty or commodity function. It's almost like I want to think about it. I want to use it. I want to take it apart. I want to reassemble it. And for me, that's, a potential value that it's sort of like, if I could read it and understand it, I'm not sure, I would be compelled, for instance, to read it again, or to think about, the gaps in my attention or the gaps in my knowledge. I think those aporia are, as necessary and as constitutive as the so-called content and understanding that we have. It's almost like I sometimes think it's maybe more important to mark the spaces of the gaps in one's knowledge than it is to understand the text. It's like I understand that, the desire for understanding is, in some sense it's a necessity, but I also think it can be a limitation. It's almost like that's why I think you should, reread poorly read texts in a maybe different context or with a different set of desires and expectations. Um, because maybe the first time you weren't really reading, you were um, rehearsing your own, desires and expectations and not actually reading what was there. Um, and that gets me back, of course, to rhetorics. How much of it is a form, of suasion or truth telling or truth effects, and not necessarily true. It's kind of like this thing comports itself in such a way, or makes certain claims, and you are eager to accede to those. And then, but on closer maybe inspection, this is just a form, a way of presenting information. It sort of reminds me of some of Foucault's ideas about um, documentary and maybe even to a lesser extent literature. It's that, if it comports itself like something, you begin to believe the way it comports itself, not necessarily the detail, of the meaning, but it's almost like you can claim that your discourse is scientific and that gives you a certain purchase. But it may not be, it may not actually be true. It's just that you're good at forms, or, like placeholders or rhetorics. It's not just the content, it's the way in which it's presented, the, claims to authority that one makes, in a text, or your desires for that authority, which may or may not be fully present. It's sort of like the reader fills in quite a bit. And, one of the things that maybe substitutes for knowledge are forms. It's sort of like, oh, yes, I recognize this. You know, um, it comports itself in the way that other texts have comported themselves, but there may not be any absolute surety of that. But if you can approximate forms very well, you can sometimes, have the effect of truth without being true. It's kind of like, and that's a fascinating idea for me. And I think that's part of, why, our politics are so bizarre. I think it's easier to appear as relating to desires, things people want to hear, as opposed to what is true. That's, if you can arrange the words in such a way as to have, the effect of truth, whether they're true or not is maybe less significant for some. It's like,
Mhm. Yeah. Well, right. And what's so interesting here is the way that this form, say the the documentary and its comportment toward truth, right? Or the rhetoric of scientificity
Right.
and how that legitimates certain claims, whether or not, as you said, they actually contain this truth value within them. I mean, really, it comes down to the form and the wholeness. And this actually loops back to this idea of reading, right? Because in the actual moment of truth, in the actual like gaps in these forms, this is where the continual interpretation, the rereading, the 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 never-ending encounter with a certain text or an idea is actually necessitated. But it's this moment of formation or the creation of a whole, of a rhetoric that prevents precisely this reinterpretation, right?
Right.
So the repetition is no longer a repetition in a new context that produces a novelty or a rereading, but simply a recurrence of the same, right? It's a repetition without the difference that you
Yeah.
mentioned with your
The,
reference
the,
to Derrida.
yeah,
Uh,
it's almost like repetition could and maybe even should be productive in some way.
mhm,
That reframing can have a kind of positive use value. This idea that repetition is or should be absolute is
mhm,
kind of like, well, that seems to be a hindrance to further productivity of meaning. It's like, I mean, often, I've done some projects where that are kind of readings in a way. They're not what the text is meant to say. They are kind of deliberate kind of slices of a text to hopefully throw into relief certain attributes of that text that may not be central. Um, Sort of, I don't know. It's a conceit I probably derived from, I guess it's Deleuze and Guattari and their idea of a minor literature, except that I kind of, reverse engineer it and sort of like look for minor or non-central moments in a text to throw some of its maybe suppositions into relief. I did one work that part of it is it's a direct quotation from an artist's diary. And the artist's diary, of course, is about the life of the artist, and I found it almost impossible to read. But then I decided there's some strange things in here. Every time like race emerges as an issue, the strange things begin to happen, and it's sort of like, oh, well, I'm going to go through this text, which is in some ways kind of painful, not because just that it's the accretion of detail is kind of, you know, difficult at a certain point. It's sort of like, I don't really care about this. But every time it seemed that race was figured in the text, even though race was not why the text exists. Um, Very strange things happen. It's almost like if there was some weirdness in the boredom, this is where the weirdness really kind of became apparent. And it's almost like it's interesting. It was almost like I was reading for difference or reading
mhm,
for a particular subject or topic, and that sort of allowed a way in. And I think maybe, maybe a kind of almost symptomatic understanding of the boredom. It's sort of like, why does this bore the fuck out of me? And it was kind of like, because maybe it's not addressed to you. And when, a subject like race comes into the picture, you realize that it's really not addressed to you, that it's kind of like a rehearsal of some things. It's like, it's like, why is this here even? This isn't even the subject of this text, and
mhm.
it's sort of like every time it shows up, it's like, get it, so,
Right.
but it's interesting, that kind of interested reading or filtered reading where it's like, oh, um, it allows you to kind of clear out, a great deal of information. And then you come down to these very, very odd incidents, in this kind of, you know, wasteland, if you will, of
Mhm.
of detail. Yeah.
Yeah. So moving back to this question of continuity, of repetition, of recurrence, it's often suggested, sort of with reference to your work, that you create continuities between recent social and political events and historical struggles. How do you understand this idea of historical recurrence? And I should insert here, how do you understand this idea of continuity? Right? Perhaps in this minoring mode, there's a different form of continuity, a
Yeah,
continuity of something withdrawn, something that's not designed for us now, or something that remains unresolved. And how does your work engage with historical materials?
yeah, that's interesting. It sort of reminds me of what I would probably say about my relationship to documentary in general. It's
Mhm.
like I think I understand documentary and its forms and claims, but I find in my personal practice that I'm actually interested in documents and how they are sort of enacted or reformed or read into kind of discursive. And so I'm interested in histories because I'm looking maybe for traces in the present. It's almost like as you were sort of observing, I think, as you were framing your question, I'm, I don't think history is actually resolved. I think history is kind of continuing, um, and it's just a matter again of framing and rereading um, to see the relations. Um, and maybe, certain forms change, certain rhetorics change, but you could make the argument that, I don't know, if the if the point or if the major framing device is white supremacy or global capitalism, it's sort of like there is this kind of implied continuity, even with all the changes, even with all the changes in language and changes in mediation or changes. It's like certain things survive even when you think this looks completely different, or we talk about this in completely different language. It's almost as though, but yeah, something persists, and that something which persists is a kind of, I don't know, it's always bothersome. It's like,
Mhm.
why is it, there's been so much change, why is it that you can, if you're looking, detect this continuity? And I don't view it in one dimension or in one register. I mean, I think there are also desires for equality and justice that also persist, that
Mhm.
people are striving to find terms and avenues towards those goals. But we kind of have this preoccupation or fantasy that all these things are going to resolve in some narrative or inevitable um, framework, and they don't. It's like it's a wishful thought. And yeah, I guess maybe it's just my you know turn of mind, but I found myself, even relatively young, being drawn to those mostly writers who questioned things like ideas like progress. It's like James Baldwin does it. I always like to say Walter Benjamin does it. um, and it's sort of like, well, what's the connection between those two figures? And for me it was kind of like, well, I'll try that uncertainty about so-called progress, um, is again, something that I see as a kind of continuity, even though they may express it in radically different contexts and forms. Maybe it's in that way, maybe it's a conceptual trope that
Mhm.
yes, people are always talking about movement. The only problem is I'm not sure it really exists, or at least in the resolved form that it's often presented. That it's more furtive, more difficult to actually take, it's like, it's though it's an expectation or myth that's presented to you. And
Mm.
what if you just sort of look at it from a different angle and realize that it's not quite, well, it's maybe working itself out, but it hasn't worked itself out. It's sort of,
Right.
it's a process, and it's never, at least in my mind, it's never, it can never be fully resolved. But that doesn't mean that it's, hopeless. It just means that it's, complicated. And
Right.
yeah, our desires for, closure and improvement um, aren't the same as those things. It's it's our desires, our thoughts about it, our hopes, um, but that, maybe that's, it's not like abandon, all hope. It's more
Mhm.
like, um, well, for me, I think it's a certain skepticism and a certain desire to kind of take apart and put back together in differential forms with, a kind of understanding that it's never going to be quite resolved.
Mm.
It's like we may want resolution and a kind of narrative sense or what have you. And it's like, well, it's great for narratives, but I'm not sure it's history in that sense. History is more complicated. Projects, useful projects get started and suspended. Do you accept the suspension and say, well, that's over, and leave it at that, or does it reappear or recur? Um, it's not even a question of, whether one wants it to recur or not. It's almost as though, I don't know, society is patterned in such a way that there are these recurrences. And there are always these like claims that, that's over or this is resolved. I mean, I think that's one of the probably animating, reasons behind a work like Black Celebration was, I kept hearing that these things were already dealt with and settled.
Mhm.
And then at the same time, I could look around me and sort of see, I don't think this is settled. This may have recoded itself, or, the way we talk about it might be different, but it looks very similar. It's not to rain on the parade or anything, but on a certain level, yeah, one must be the rain for the parade because,
Right.
yeah,
Okay. This idea of raining on the parade and your references to desire throughout act as a really excellent segue to the piece that cites Leiden's Anger as an Energy. And all four of the pieces, I think, share a concern with the role of emotion or affects in ongoing political struggles. Shock, shame, grief, desire weave through each of the videos, and these affective responses are treated as a potential ground for critique, for organization, and for mobilization. How does your work engage with and even reproduce these intensities, these affects? And how do you think about the relation between the form of your work and and the viewer's body, right, in this affective sense?
yeah, that's again, a kind of complex and compound question. I mean, I
Mhm.
think I'll take it from the body, and then maybe I can get you to rewind and rehearse for me the other parts.
Mhm.
I mean, I began, maybe for me, it began actually with trying to think through what possibilities and desires for me are activated by certain forms of popular music. Um, I knew that it had always been important for me as a register. And I began to actually think about, are there, specific reasons why this occurs? Is it just, a kind of contagion, if you will, of the body by sound?
Mhm.
Um, does it actually help, analytically? Could it help analytically? And then I began, of course, thinking about um, ideas in relationship to the body, not as though the body and the mind are completely separate, but that they might actually have numerous relationships with one another. Um, and then I began linking it maybe to an idea like Paul Gilroy, and thinking about the circulation of vinyl records all over the world, and people being able to associate states of being and struggles with the circulation of these vinyl records. Um, and that, in a way, they function not only as, literature in the kind of narrative and pleasure producing aspect, but also as kind of history and historiography. And so um, I began slowly, I think, thinking that maybe, activities of the body and the sonic register were useful in maybe thinking critically and analytically, not in any, absolute or direct sense, but almost as a kind of differential model, a different place from which to mount, a social critique, for instance. Um, and that, maybe a kind of dismissive attitude towards the popular was, what's the word, a missed opportunity in a certain sense.
Mhm.
That, if you could imagine that critique could come from the most I don't know, unexpected, source, things that, you would say, oh, well, this is silly, this is corrupt. But you could also say that that same silly thing is a coping mechanism. And if that's what it is, maybe it's something in addition to that, a way of surviving under, certain pressures and stresses. And so it began to sort of function as, well, you mean it's totally empty, totally irredeemable, in that way. And so I think in a certain way, thinking about it retrospectively, it's almost like there has to be some positive possibility in it. And the idea of like something both occupying and delivering knowledge, if you will, to the body as well as the mind simultaneously sounds like a glorious thing. Maybe it is a kind of imaginary, but I'm not sure that the idea, let's say the kind of limited Adornian idea that it's just, a commodity that stupefies, um, just, it doesn't really comport with my own experience, I guess. And, I sort of say, well, that's fine, for him and his, models of what music can and should do. But maybe
Mhm.
I have different ideas and different models. So, yeah.
Yeah.
And, for me, I think it is like possibilities of, the mind and the body sort of existing, you know, in tandem in, complex ways, that it's not, again, it's not a linear relationship, and it's not just about, I don't know, consciousness or thought per se. That, yeah, it's more complex than that. It's almost one of the highest compliments I think my work has ever received was at one point, I think in the early 2000s, my dear colleague Ellen Rooney said that my work was ideas that you can dance to. And it's sort of
Mm.
like, is that possible? And if it's not possible, why isn't it possible? I mean, I understand that there are, issues, problems, and that, we're trying to figure them out and cope with them. But this idea that, oh, there is nothing there, nothing, anything of the body, is drawing us away from, full consciousness. It's
Mhm.
like, what if that's not true? Or what if, there are modes of sociality and being in public that are enabled by, these simple practices, that are pleasure producing. And, could pleasure actually lead to thinking and knowledge? I'm not sure everyone would, agree with that. But for me, I think it's, I don't know, if you don't have some notionality of that as a possibility, it seems as though huge parts of African diaspora culture um, are, discarded and diminished in certain ways. And I'm not comfortable with that. Not that I idealize popular music in that way, because I have lots of, questions about it. But almost in the same way we were talking earlier about, histories, it's like, wow, histories are pretty negative. And yet there are still, desires and maybe even necessities for critique and action that um, can't be closed off. You know, you would like to close them off and say, you will never, exist in this, in this context or in this space. But there are, eruptions, openings, gaps, and this thing appears. I don't know whether it's a chimera or whether it's futures. And I think in some ways I'd just as soon wager, on one side, and rather than saying, oh, this is impossible and this is useless. It's like, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, trying to think of how to formulate this question. Um, well, I guess the intent of my question was right, trying to think this idea of anger as an energy or frustration as an energy, right, in exactly the way that you've just outlined, which is that there is something that emerges in pleasure, in frustration, and precisely these moments of sort of bristling up against a text or reading against the grain or recoding certain historical texts, um, or even circulating certain records or
Yeah.
finding and filling something that seems vacuous or something that seems to be a simple pleasure, right? And that this does produce a political energy. This does vectorize social space in a particular way. Um,
Yeah.
and that
Sometimes
it can ground, right, a form of organization, a form of political collectivity that isn't necessarily grounded on progress or isn't interested in that same rhetoric of history, but
right.
is seeking out different types of openings and futures, as you mentioned. Um, so, right, I guess I'm thinking about how to connect this to the Leiden citation, um, and about the place of, I guess, both anger and frustration in your work, but
Yeah.
also pleasure, the pleasure of music, the pleasure of the purely visual pleasure of color, right?
Right.
And how all of these things, yeah, fit together in some way for you.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, what Leiden basically says is that he thinks that pleasure has kind of a bad rep in that, people think that it's only negative and that it can actually be useful. I think there are limits, of course. I think that sometimes anger um, is, more negative energy than energy. But if you use it, obviously to try to imagine and activate possibilities, it's a place to start, um, but maybe not a place, to end up or a kind of panacea. I mean, but this idea that anger is totally off limits is a kind of weird displacement. It's like, well, that would be nice if everything, if everything were peaceable, and everything came from peaceable origins. But there's a lot of complexity and negativity in the world, and so um, and it's also thorny. I think he has made a life for himself as a curmudgeon of a certain sort, or as a bearer of bad news, or rainer on the parade. and now he's come out as a fan of Trump. And, a lot of the energy, if you will, of punk rock seems to have leached its way into conservative politics and, this so-called populism, that it represents, the sort of disruption fixation, that you see in figures like Steve Bannon, for instance, and is that a misreading of punk, or is this just sort of an amplification of certain negatives that are also, kind of included in that? But I almost pulled it out as a kind of historical example. And, for people who kind of know the rest of the story, I think it's also maybe a bit of a cautionary tale.
Mhm.
But it was also, there's a kind of more specific reading, which is, someone asked me about the place of anger in my work, and I was like, well, it's a complex place, but on the other hand, I would admit that, and I have said this on numerous occasions, if if things didn't bother me, I'm not sure I'd make work about them.
Mhm.
Sometimes I do make work about pleasure and possibility, but sometimes I make work out of, a kind of frustration with, the illegibilities of histories, for instance, or just, you know, as I said, something like poor readings. It's like
Mhm.
readings that are not, productive or generative. You know, um, And it's not even maybe even a question of misreadings. It's sort of like non-readings. A story appears and it's almost as though it was not read. It was
Mhm.
just not read. Um, Things that could or should bother you appear not to.
Mhm.
It's like it's kind of perverse. It yeah pisses you off. Yeah,
Mhm.
and that often you know is a place to begin, but not necessarily, at least for me, a place to end. And, I think maybe the person who asked me the question was like, well, your work is always, kind of about serious topics, and yet you don't seem to be, terribly serious. And it's like, well, maybe it's displacement, because it does come from, you could say, a thoughtful and negative place.
Mhm.
Um, but you can't. It's almost like it's like the whole thing around authorship. It's like you don't necessarily have to perform one's anger. One could actually
Mhm.
sublimate and work it through, or think about, how it operates. I think it's always a little misleading to think, that everything has to be on, at the same level and at the same intensity.
Mhm.
It's like you kind of find your way, and you're not, you know, I don't know, responsible to reproduce, someone else's, expectation and affect. And
Mhm.
I think that's, a kind of principal problem. People think that things, should somehow be the same, but they're always kind of more complicated or a little bit different, or maybe hugely different. And yeah, it's like, and it's like too, it's like I need to know who's speaking. And it's sort of like, well, if you suspend that desire, you might see something in the speech that you didn't see before, when you thought you were secure in the knowledge of who's speaking, you know
Mhm.
or who ought to be speaking, or yeah, those kinds of desires and expectations, if you will,
Mhm.
um, have implications, you could argue. I don't it's almost as though you think you understand what's going on, and so you kind of stop reading,
Mhm.
or stop
Mhm.
reading, for how this thing might work. You kind of, take it, and in that glorious phrase, at face value. It's sort of like um, comforting, but maybe not advisable. Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm. The use of reference or recoding calls to mind a set of questions that circulate throughout your work, questions regarding property, expropriation, and appropriation. On one level, your use of citation cannot but raise such questions as to whom does culture belong, who has the right to own, extract value from, or control cultural products. But at a different level, these questions arise within a very specific context, namely the regimes of expropriation and dispossession to which Black people have been and continue to be subjected. Can you say a few words about the relationship between your work, property, and the acts of dispossession to which the texts in your films refer?
Yeah, a thorny one in many ways. Yeah, I guess I feel like property is a kind of invention, and that it is used to marginalize and mitigate people. The idea that people could be treated as property is a kind of, deeply offensive and scary notion. And yet, there's a certain amount of wealth, if you will, that's established in that, equation, and just, in a huge amount of disequilibrium also, that people seek to maintain. I've always been interested maybe in that question about who's authorized to speak and act, and the question of what are the, the legacies of chattel slavery, and I think they're not exceptional circumstances, they are constitutive circumstances. And
Mm,
maybe that's not an argument that I make hyper explicitly, but it's sort of something that is always in my mind.
mm,
It's like I can't get it out in a certain way. Um, and that's why, in some ways, to go back to that old chestnut Black celebration, some people would like look at it and say, slavery and a critique of the commodity, or civil rights and the critique of the commodity. And I sort of see them actually as inextricably linked. This idea that people are treated as property. I don't know, I don't know what commodity realm, you've been living in, but that's pretty straightforward in a certain
mhm,
sense. And that continues to reverberate, through cultures and desires and expectations around culture, um, is kind of, central. I can't imagine, going around in the world not thinking, that that is the case. But it's possible. Almost anything is. Um, yeah, I think even that, question around property and propriety and who gets to speak was something that I found actually in the situationist text, that contestation around who is authorized, what happens if I take this thing which is known and kind of change the register in which it speaks, or our expectations with regard to what it means. And that to some extent I think is kind of contestation around what the value of property is, or what the value that's promulgated by certain systems that we you know are imbricated in, like, on a daily basis. So yeah, I don't think there's any kind of easy and comfortable answers. But I do think questions of, who is speaking, who's allowed to speak, um, who has the right to do this, in what circumstances, and what limitations, if any, obtain, are kind of important questions. Um, and I hope that you could argue the obverse of that kind of control and property is also in evidence. I kind of agree with those latter day sinners who believe that the desires, um, that the commodity and advertising operate on are human products, and that no one, strictly speaking, owns those. People may claim, copyright over a color or of a riff or of something, but it's like that ownership, and I don't know, its resonance um, can't be quantified in that way. Um, it's almost as though um, we believe in a fiction, that everything can be monetized and determined. Um, and there are, certain circumstances in which, you can find yourself in a great deal of trouble if you manipulate those things. But on the other hand, I believe it comes from people rather than from the commodity or from, the the artifact itself. It's more complicated than simple ownership, once and for all, and determine, a kind of one way, singular determination. Um, and so I think in my work, I'm working to recode things that, again, we claim are familiar to us, but which, I don't know, we contribute to in terms of our attention and in terms of our um, interest. Um, and yeah, I think that's something that perhaps warrants greater recognition. That culture maybe is culture is not property in a kind of legalistic sense. And it's sort of like, is land even property? And to what extent is it, but those are kind of arguments that maybe have to do with a pre or post-capitalist viewpoint. I think Jacques Attali, the music theorist and critic and economist, once said something like, things had values and meanings before they had a price.
Mm.
It was not like, it's not the price that confers meaning or authority.
Mm-hmm.
It's more, what desires and beliefs, the price allegedly encodes. But there was, value before there were prices. And then it becomes maybe a contestation over what you value, what your values are.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe, yeah, it's sort of like, well, I think there was, society and exchange and desire and action before, there was a market. And of course, you can just look around you and observe that the market does not really solve all problems or heal all wounds. Um, it's sort of like, I think if anything, we've seen recently with COVID is that the market's not doing too well basic human needs. Some things, it does extraordinarily well, speaking of, expropriation. But there's certain basic things that it doesn't do very well at all. Or doesn't, create institutions and forms that actually speak to, you could argue, human needs. So it's very, very strange. It's like we keep being told that, the market will provide. It almost sounds religious, It's like, if you believe in this, you will be taken care of and you'll be provided for.
Mm-hmm.
But, not everyone, obviously not. And then you get these very, very strange, pontifications like America has the best healthcare system in the world. And it's sort of like, if this is the best, it's like, ugh.
Well, Tony, that is the end of my line of questioning here, and I just wanted to thank you very much for speaking with me.
Oh, thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you. It was an absolute pleasure.
Circa offers a very important platform.
It's really just asking us to pause in this moment.
Art can be a form of disruption when it appears on such a exposed place as the Piccadilly advertising screen.
Hello.
Hi, it's Hans.
My wish would really be that we could find it in our mind and hearts to really work as one people.
Public art right now can only be important if it supports your community.
See Your Name in Lights is our fundraising initiative to challenge this model of only having kind of, rich 1% funding and supporting the arts.